I am pretty sure that Bandai created the Kouryuu Densetsu Villgust series solely to maximize confusion. Even in Japan, Bandai seemed to want to make it as difficult as possible for people to get into Villgust. Villgust started in 1987 as a gashapon toy. Not gachapon, gashapon. Gachapon came about because gashapon was Bandai's trademark for capsule toys, and everyone else wanted a similar name. The idea is you'd get a capsule out of those vending machines and it might have a little fantasy warrior in it, or it might have equipment for them. And you'd basically dress them up like that. Bandai discontinued the series pretty quickly after a brief trial run, but there was a pretty big response from fans who were looking for the rest of the figures, equipment, and monsters. So Bandai brought it back, and didn't do any marketing. It was when they decided to deploy a second series in 1990 that Bandai tried to sell Villgust to people. They added comics and cartoons that gave the series a proper story, which was about teenagers from Japan being transported to a fantasy world where they needed to stop an evil god. As part of the second series, they created a new line of characters that were mostly animal people. They also introduced a way to level up characters by collecting experience points from packages. You could mail them and a figure into Bandai and get a leveled up version of that character. Unfortunately, Bandai transferred the person who was in charge of handling that program, and so a lot of kids didn't get their leveled up characters. In the middle of this whole mess, Bandai published Kouryuu Densetsu Villgust for the Super Famicom. It was a pretty by-the-numbers RPG that adapted the storyline from the first series. But what were the characters from the second series doing during that first series? Well, that's why we have Kouryuu Densetsu Villgust Gaiden. And for once, the Gaiden actually is a spin-off story. You start the game controlling Murobo the Wolfman, and he's a very good boy. But it won't be long before you add the cat girls Sylvie and Rukia to your team. While you're walking around, you hit the B button to interact, so that would be your speak or search, and the A button will open a menu. You can only see one command at a time, though. From that menu, you can check out your character's stats, change equipment, use items or spells, and change the party's marching order. In towns, you'll find shops and inns. And by shops, I mean one shop. There's a single store that sells equipment and items. Later in the game, some towns give you the opportunity to upgrade your equipment at forges. Naturally, the inn is where you recover your health and magic, and it's also where you go to save. You don't recover status effects at the inn, though. To do that, you'll have to go to a church. There's an unusual feature to exploration in this game. The map doesn't just have an indoor and outdoor scale like a lot of RPGs from the time do. You'll exit the first town into the first region, and then can exit the first region into the wider world. You won't find a whole lot to do there until you've progressed the story a bit. It's just something that gives the Villgust Gaiden a distinct sense of scale. When you encounter monsters while exploring, it's time for combat. And here's where things get weird. Combat is presented to you as this wheel of enemies. Your party will engage with them, starting with the top enemy and then going counterclockwise. Each region represents a spot where one of your party members will fight. This is where the party order matters, because the characters will follow that around the circle. Not that party order matters a whole lot, because if you're surprised by enemies, then they'll just pick the order that they want. Combat is kind of an action minigame handled from a side view. A jumps and B attacks. If you hit select, then you go to a submenu where you can equip a spell or item. You use them by holding down up and pressing B. Magic comes to characters as they level up, and there actually isn't a whole lot of magic in the game. Characters will typically only learn 3 or 4 spells, if they're even capable of learning spells. Once you've defeated all of the enemies on the wheel, then you get experience and gold. And of course you can keep playing. The action in combat isn't the best. I found that if an enemy is taking an action, then it tends to lock you out of being able to jump or attack. There is some difference between how characters perform. The cat girls are martial artists, for example. They have pretty good jumps, but their attacks are only punching. While Murobo moves more stiffly, and has an axe that sweeps when he attacks. Urobo's the stronger character, while the cat girls wind up with some magic. Progression in Villgust Gaiden seemed to be pretty quick. In the hour that I had to play the game, I managed to get through the first 2 dungeons, and I got that far even with poking around a bit at the beginning. You will likely want to do a little bit of grinding. The way battles are structured mean that everyone has to fight, and a level 1 character is going to just get chewed up. While Villgust was fairly popular at the time in Japan, or at least as popular as it ever would be, it seems like Villgust Gaiden has kind of fallen in the cracks. It's also a very rare game. You just don't see copies come up for sale very often. My feelings on Villgust Gaiden come down to how well the combat works, and there, the game could be better. There's only a few kinds of monsters, probably because they were taken directly from the toys, and they have some very basic attack patterns to learn. Once you know those attack patterns, then even your weakest character can easily take them out. And that makes the action slow down a lot. Combined with the usual high encounter rate, I wound up going, let's just get on with it. It doesn't help that the dungeon design is really uninspiring. The first dungeon was a bunch of branching paths that all looped back on each other, and there was nothing in the dungeon until you got to the end. And then the second dungeon was essentially one extremely long path. Dungeon exploring should be a big part of an RPG, and it's not really good here. Maybe later dungeons are better, but if that's the case, don't lead with your boring stuff. Kouryuu Densetsu Villgust Gaiden seems to be only for fans of Villgust. Anyone else isn't going to find a whole lot exciting here.